Hello, everyone. This is B Belt Dan, and for this episode, I'm going to try something a little bit different. Well, for you, it's probably going to be different, but for me, it's not different because I've actually done this before. I'm going to try to attempt to make a figurine, kind of a toy. So I'm using Sculpey for this, as you can see. So I take some out and I'm kneading it right now to try to get it because it's a very firm type of Sculpey, so it's very hard right off the bat. But the more that you work with it and you knead it, it actually starts to kind of soften up to where you can really try to, mold it into the shape that you want and maybe even get some of the details that you are looking for. Now, what am I going to be making? This is going to be an original character that I created a long time ago. In fact, you've actually seen me make a mask of this character. This character is an entry I created for the Hellraiser universe. The story takes the idea on what would happen when a Cenobite was summoned by a civilization that would literally perceive it as a god. And in doing so, the Cenobite starts to lose sight on what he really is. So I'm starting with the head first so I can try to get the proportions down. And I'm using a variety of different tools here that I have at my disposal to try to get the shapes in. Right now I'm starting to work on the sockets, but then I work on all the other shapes as well, the nose, the mouth, the chin. And these are tools that I have bought over time, but it's a little bit of a tip for all of y'all that is wanting to start off on this. If you don't have these tools, you can just take and you can carve them and shape them into these type of tools, or you can actually find things around the house. You can use pencils or pen nibs and stuff like that. Anything that has kind of a bit of a shape that you can use to try to help you sculpt these things. But even if you decide to buy some of these tools, they're really not that expensive. So I've made this character several times. I drew him out several times, and I've sculpted, once again, the mask, the face of this character before. So it's nothing really new to me. So I don't have any references that I can go off of. I'm doing this strictly by memory, which, as you'll see a little bit later, or you'll probably start to realize, I probably should have done some references. Not because of the look of the character, but just over the overall dimensions and the size of the character, as you'll see. So, another reason why I'm attacking this is because sculpting, I will say, is not necessarily my strongest suit, but it is something that I want to actually start trying to get better in. And sculpting on such a small scale, I'm hoping that would actually help me develop some of the confidence that I need to be able to start sculpting some of the larger things. Because if I can sculpt some fine details on a small object, sculpting bigger details on a bigger object should not be of any kind of a problem for me. So as you can see, I've already laid in the mouth, and if you remember from the mask that I made, the mouth is severely stretched out by the chains. And the reason why it's stretched out by the chains is because this character is known as the Chain Master. Like his name implies, he was given control of the chains of hell by Leviathan itself. Chains run all throughout his body, which not only is used to disfigure his face, as you'll see, or you saw in the mask, but also for him to use as devices of torture or to capture victims that tried to flee from the horror that was summoned before them. So as I'm working on the larger details, I start moving slowly into the smaller details. As you can see right now, I'm working on the eye sockets and hollowing them out and trying to get that grotesque shape, as even the eye sockets are being pulled by the eventual chains that you will see that I will add in later. So I'm using this Sculpey, but I don't know if this might be the best type that I could probably use for this. I don't know whether for future iterations I might experiment with some of the softer clays, or maybe even some of the harder clays, to try to get the look that I'm wanting and to get the ease that I'm looking. Maybe not even clay at all, maybe a wax. So here is the head, as he is. It is almost finished in the sculpting, and you can see the type of torment that he has been put through. Now, once again, this is a figurine that I am making, and a figurine has some points of articulation. So I am going to try to first go with as many as points of articulation as possible. So right now what I'm making here are some of the ball and socket joints that is going to be comprising most of the articulation in the wrists and in the arms and in the legs and everything like that. So I take a little bit of this clay and I try to mold it, and I have a hand that I've also molded, and I'm making a hole where I will put in a part that ball and socket joint which I've made, and I've actually already hardened using the oven inside it. That would also allow me to be able to hold on to that small hand and sculpt it even further with further details without me risking pressing into the soft clay of the hand and messing up some of the details that I do. And this was probably one of the hardest parts for me, was to mold the hand, and I actually had to do this several times because it ended up being that the hand would either be too small in relation to the head or too large. So so I had to re-sculpt it again to try to get the hand to the right size in relation to the head. So as you can see here, I'm working on more details onto the hand. For the Chainmaster wears kind of a glove that covers two of his fingers and his thumb, but leaves two other fingers exposed, so you can see the flesh underneath it. Now, because this is a learning process for me, I end up making a few mistakes along the way, as you are about to see here. Because originally I intended for this to have as many points of articulation as possible, but this Sculpey was very brittle no matter how much time I put it inside the oven, and so I've had to attempt several times. Either they wound up way too big and so I had to make them smaller, or the joints would just completely break, as you can see right here. So Sculpey, good thing for me to try to use to sculpt it, to get the details, but to be the actual finished product, it's not something that is very durable. But I still continue forward, and my decision is to use fewer points of articulation inside the character, but where I'm going to lack inside its points of articulation, I'm going to try to make up for in its pose and its look. So here I'm once again attempting a hand. This one being much smaller than all the other ones that I've had, which is helping me kind of hone my skills in sculpting smaller objects. And with the hand itself being finished, I've decided to go ahead and try sculpting it in pieces. So right here, this is the glove itself, which is going to attach to the arm. And I'm working on the small details, such as this buckler that goes around the arm. Now, a little bit more about this character is that he dates back before the rise of the Egyptian Empire, so he's a very old Cenobite, and because he was before the Lament Configuration's creation, he would be summoned instead when a sacrifice was performed before a hellish relic. For almost an entire pharaoh's rule, he was summoned nearly weekly, with each visit costing 2 lives, one to bring him to earth, and the other that he took back with him to hell. With each visit, he was treated as a god, and for a time, the Chainmaster actually started to believe that he was one. So here I have the finished arm and the finished glove, and I'm going to use super glue to put these two pieces together. And the one thing I will say with this Sculpey is that super glue works very well with it. The bond almost happens instantaneously, and if I've had any breaks on this, after piecing this together, I've never had it break where it was super glued. It would break somewhere else. It would never break on the bond of the super glue. So I have the two of the arms finished and the head. Now it is time for me to go ahead and start moving on to the legs. So here I have the legs, and I'm working on trying to get the general pose of it. His entire body is going to have to stand on these two legs, be propped up on these two legs. Now, because of the difficulty that I'm having with these points of articulation, I've decided to make the legs themselves static. The torso is going to be able to move on top of the hip, so there'll be that points of articulation, but the legs themselves are going to be static. So I want to get the pose to be as imposing as I can, action oriented, but still stable enough for him to move. So just in case you're wondering what happens to this character of the Chain Master, well, due to the religious actions of religious zealots of Ra, the Chain Master was lost to hell, and other Cenobite generals was tasked with being keepers of the chains, with the most recent Cenobite being Pinhead. However, the chains still await for their eventual return of the original wielder. Now here I am putting in some extra little details, trying to get some texture on his pants here. And I'm finishing up that texture with some of this writing from hell, which this writing has a particular significance, and to where it is also the spell that is written on not only his clothes but also the flesh himself, that gives him the ability, and him primarily the ability, to be able to control the chains of hell. So the legs are done, and they're in their final position, ready for me to go ahead and mount the body on it, which I'm working on right now. The body was probably one of the most trickier aspects, because I had to build it around the head and the arms and even the hips themselves, the hip joints, to where they would hold the joints in, but they won't freeze once I finally seal it in. So I couldn't just slap a big piece together, and mold it. I had to actually put it in piece by piece together, smoothing everything out and trying to get all these textures and constantly moving the joints to prevent, to leave enough of a space with inside the clay for those joints to move around freely. And as you could probably start to see here, with the body almost completely finished, as I go ahead and put the belt that is going to be around the waist to also hide the seam of where his rotation is on his hip and his torso, he is not to proper scale, or he is not, his arms are a bit too long, his hands are still too big for his head is too small for his entire body, the proportions of him is not accurate. At this point in time is when I really started to realize that I should have drawn a good scale picture and a reference picture of him to go off of, that I could have used not only to keep the look consistent of the character, but also for me to use as reference to make sure that the hands is going to be in good relation to the head, and the head is relation to the body, and the body is in good relation to the arms. But as you can see here, once again, once I heated it all up, it broke again, and it all shattered. But as I said, once I put some super glue on and glued it all back together, everything went together nice, and he is in one piece, and he is able to move around. So I go ahead and I give him a good base coat of paint, and I use kind of a dark gray first, and then I start putting on the black. I want to use a bit of a dark gray for the entire body, because I don't want him to be all completely jet black. I want some contrast within his costume. different layers of black, or different dark shades of gray and everything. So we said that the chain master was taken care of by zealots of Ra, but the chain master does return, resurrected in a time that is unknown to him. But even after all these centuries, he has laid dormant, except for a few nightmarish flashes. He has forgotten what he is and what may await for him if he ever tries to return to hell. And now it is time for me to go ahead and start painting in his flesh and his blood. Right back here, as you can see, he has these two open back wounds, which you'll see that will eventually show where the chains rise from his body and go into his arms, into his fingers. So now I go through and I paint his flesh. I don't want to go with a straight white. I use a cover of white, but then I go through with a very, very pale flesh color and even touch in some of the shadows with some grays for that contrast. I want to give him to where, yes, he has his soul sucked or the blood sucked from his body, but at the same time, he still has just a little bit of life. For as we can see, the blood that comes out of his wounds from the fingertips where the chains, the hooks burst out of, and on his head of where the wires are digging into his face as the chains stretch those facial features and stretch that smile onto his face to hide the agony that the character is constantly, truthfully in. And once again, sticking with the idea of contrast, I go back to the back where all the blood is and I put in a little bit of a darker red in some areas, but I've also used some clear gloss to kind of give this wet look on to all of his exposed bloody areas, and even onto some parts of his costume to make it look more like it is a glossier wet leather. Now I'm using some fine wire here and I'm cutting it and I'm bending it into the shape of the hooks that are going to be coming out of his hands. And I'm using super glue to hold that in. On each one of his hands, he has two of the hooks which burst out, tearing up the fingertips. And the hooks are tied into long chains that he can send forth out to grab a hold of those that are trying to get away from him. And to make the chain, I've used some very thin wire that I found folded in half. And I use a skewer for the space of the chain links. And I put it in and I twist it around. And I take each chain link and I twist it a different direction. So therefore the chain isn't constantly in tension in one direction or the other. It's going back and forth, back and forth. And I do that across the entire length. And that gives me a very good representation of what the chain would look like. And those chains I'm going to attach coming out from his shoulder and his biceps that go and they enter into his back. And once again I use super glue to hold this all in. And so now I test it all out, and all of the points of articulation work. Not to the range of motion that I would like, but considering how this is the first figurine that I have made in over 20 years, I think I did a pretty good job. And here we have it, the finished character, the finished Chain Master. Let me know if you would like to hear more of the story of the Chain Master, and if you would like to see me create more, I will be happy to try to make a better version of this figure, or I can make the 3 disciples, which he unwillingly creates. And everybody, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.